All right, everyone, we're going to get started with our next panel here over the Great Firewall, social media in restricted information spaces. Our discussants will be on Zoom today, and now I'm going to pass over the microphone to our discussant today. Dr. Kounalakis is a visiting fellow at the Stanford University's Hoover Institution and a senior fellow at the Center on Media, Data, and Society at Central European University. Dr. Kounalakis, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And this is actually a continuation of and an expansion of that prior panel, which was looking at TikTok and the restricted environment that we're looking at here within the United States. The title of the panel is Over the Great Firewall, Social Media in Restricted Information Spaces. And we were supposed to have three guests. The third one, who is with Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, Patrick Bowler, unfortunately is stuck in Moldova. And so he is unable to join us. He is somewhere in Chisinau and trying to get a flight back to his office in Prague. So so this is going to turn into an all Freedom House panel. And we will be looking first at the global implications and the global understanding of this great firewall and how they exist in various countries. And then we'll take a deeper dive into the Middle East on this, and then we'll open it up and we'll have a number of, we'll have a dialogue and a series of questions. But just to give context, I certainly experienced the Great Firewall years ago, back when it was more of a bold border. I used to work in the international shortwaves at Radio Sweden International, and we would broadcast into the Soviet Union back then. We had nice, strong antennas, so jamming was not a very effective method of blocking the Radio Sweden broadcasts, but that was the 1980s equivalent of what we're now referring to as the Great Firewall. So let me turn it over to our two panelists. And the first one I'll turn to is Allie Funk, who is the Research Director for Technology and Democracy for Freedom House. And she's an expert on human rights in the digital age with a focus on free expression, privacy, surveillance, and censorship. And she also happens to lead the Freedom House's Technology and Democracy Initiative. And one more thing, she represents Freedom House on the Freedom Online Coalition's advisory network. So Allie, if you would just sort of start us off, give us an overview and really contextualize this globally for us, if you would.
Yeah, happy to. And thanks so much to everyone for having me. I hope you're enjoying the conference. My name's Allie, like it was mentioned. I'm the Research Director for Technology and Democracy at Freedom House. For folks who don't know, Freedom House is an independent organization. We were founded in 1941, so we've been around for a while. We've seen a lot in the democracy space. And I oversee Freedom on the Net, which is an annual study of internet freedom in 70 countries around the world. And we've been doing that report since 2009. So really, since kind of the origins of the Arab Spring and what we thought the internet would bring us and social media would bring us. So I'm going to start my remarks of really setting the stage of why more governments are trying to build these sort of firewalls. So what's the justification for that? And then what is the impact for those so-called firewalls? And I think it really begins with, this concept of what I just mentioned of the internet. It was hailed as this liberating force, something that was going to bring about more freedom, more democracy, better protections for human rights. And we sort of all seen how that's not the case. It's also a tool for repression. A few years back in actually 2021, Freedom on the Net's main focus for that year was thinking about how social media specifically and how tech platforms, how more governments were increasingly trying to assert their authority over these platforms. So, a lot of different efforts for governments to wield platforms' power for their own political ends. So using this regulation playbook that they could use to increase censorship and increase surveillance in their own countries. So, several different governments were passing different laws around, requiring social media companies to remove broad categories of speech without court orders, consumers or forcing companies to have in-country staff members, and these different types of provisions at the time, and they're ongoing still, are really allowing for political leaders to censor political dissent and investigative reporting, or people who were simply expressing themselves. And really, these type of laws popping up in countries across the democratic spectrum. So, most closed environments like China and Russia and Iran have sort of had these laws for years, but moving into backsliding democracies in democratic countries too, like India. So I'll touch on an Indian example. The IT rules there, require large social media companies to police content that undermine the country's public order, morality, decency, which have been used to sort of censor political speech in the country. And then, relatedly, many sort of companies now in the countries that they're operating in are being required to localize data or retain data. And, data localization really just makes the personal data of users in the country easier to access by governments. So really just this increasing regulatory oversight that we saw of social media. And despite increasing legal control over these platforms, they were still being used largely, as spaces for free expression and activism and pushing for democracy and pushing for better protections for human rights. I think a really great example of it is in Myanmar, where Facebook and Twitter were really used to coordinate, protests against the junta's deadly coup in 2021. So really the continued resilience of the internet and social media as spaces for human rights, it's spaces to push back against authoritarian governments, has led governments to actually go further than regulating it. So what they've tried to do, instead of just saying, we're going to regulate these platforms and try to force them into what we want them to do, we're actually just going to try to silo our own information spaces altogether. So then, people who are in our countries, they don't have access to the global internet where they have, different platforms to choose from, different information sources. Instead, they're just going to have access to a domestic internet that really looks like an online information space that we can cultivate. So one in which disinformation dominates, but critical commentary can be suppressed. So, if zooming in, this concept is kind of called internet fragmentation. So it's the same, just a different wonkier term than saying, building their own firewalls of trying to replicate what China has done. And we dove into really, what are the three different ways that internet fragmentation is happening around the world? So how are governments really building up these firewalls? The first was, some countries are trying to disconnect from the global internet altogether, and they're doing this by centralizing control over domestic technical infrastructure from global internet infrastructure. And it's really here the world's most authoritarian regimes are able to pull this off, because centralizing domestic infrastructure has high political and economic and societal costs. Second, more governments are passing legislation that limits the flow of user data across borders. So like I mentioned, really trying to centralize or localize data there. And then doing that creates easier barriers for state surveillance. And then the third form of fragmentation, the third effort of building the Great Firewall in each country, is really authorities are trying to limit access to information that is based outside of the country. And this, limiting access to foreign content is really the most common way that we're seeing governments build these firewalls. So out of the 70 countries we cover for Freedom on the Net, at least 47 of them restricted foreign speech. And it's often, these efforts really ramp up during political transition, protests, elections, time of conflict, that we're seeing that. And then, the other sort of component of this that I'll mention before wrapping up, passing to Cathryn, is alongside efforts to build, governments to build their own firewalls, to censor foreign speech, to force data to be held, in country, and to break off infrastructure. We're also seeing a lot of political leaders bolstering support for state-aligned social media platforms that are more receptive to their demands than some international platforms. So, an example that I like to think about a lot is Russia. The government requires that mobile phones are preloaded with domestic social media apps like VK. And the government has really also forced or offered, social media influencers in the country payments that if they switch to Rutu, which is the domestic version of YouTube, or Yappy, which is the domestic version of TikTok, influencers get a monthly payment, and then they have to sort of toe the government's editorial line. So an interesting way of investing in domestic tech sectors that are more susceptible to government censorship and surveillance. So what does all this mean in practice for human rights and fundamental freedoms and democracy? Really, internet fragmentation and the building of these firewalls, and has serious consequences because governments can simply get away with more repression if they have control over the domestic portion of their internet. So on a fragmented internet, people may not have access to the same messaging platforms that their family members or like-minded communities who live abroad do. And this means it's harder for them to communicate with each other. So we think about, following Russia's brazen invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin blocked Facebook and Twitter for people in Russia. What that meant is that folks who were trying to, protest and build solidarity and share reliable information from foreign sources, or to reach foreign audiences to try to, gin up sort of efforts for accountability, they had limited opportunity to do that because they didn't have access to these sources in the same way. So really clear human rights implications for these building of these firewalls and how social media can be used. With that, we've got a lot to dive into, so I will stop there and I'll pass it to Cathryn or back to the moderator.
Okay, thank you, Allie. And that was a great overview, and we'll come back to you. And we've got an audience, I'm sure, that's going to be interested in following up on some of these questions. So Cathryn, who's following you, is also at Freedom House, and she's a research analyst there covering the Middle East and North Africa. And she's been working on freedom of the world, freedom on the net, and election watch for the digital age. And Cathryn, your research is focused on technology, democracy, and human rights in this region. And you've been writing a fair amount. So why don't you take it up and take some of what Allie has just spoken about and maybe give us some Middle Eastern examples or extend what she's discussed to the region.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thanks for hosting us. So yeah, I'm going to go into some examples from these trends that Allie outlined, and specifically in the Middle East, North Africa region, where social media has really been a powerful tool for people to speak freely, express themselves in ways that they may not be able to do offline. So, over the last decade, we've seen journalists or activists using these platforms to mobilize around various human rights issues, democracy issues. Of course, one of the most prominent examples, I think, is in 2011 during the Arab Spring. We can think of Egyptians using Twitter to mobilize protests during that time. More recently, we've seen Iranians, members of the Iranian diaspora, using social media to call for freedom or document abuses by government forces amid the ongoing protests. But repressive regimes in the region have also sought to really rein in the power of social media, and this is through censorship, passing legislation, or launching criminal charges against social media users. I think, in Saudi Arabia, this is perhaps one of the most egregious examples of this criminalization that we've seen in the last year, where a woman was charged to a 34-year prison sentence for her kind of activism content on Twitter. But this is really happening, across the region, maybe not quite to that extent, and it's happening across social media platforms. We've also seen, in the last year alone, authorities in several countries in the region blocking access to social media platforms. So we see some governments kind of restricting this access more systematically. So this could be during, school exams where different communications or social media platforms are blocked for a short period of time. We see this in Iraq and in Jordan. But this kind of censorship, it also kind of has a more ad hoc method. So this could be, as Allie mentioned, in response to politically or socially sensitive times, such as elections, protests, natural disasters. In February, we saw Turkey block Twitter for 12 hours following the earthquakes, kind of under the guise of combating harmful disinformation. And again, going back to Iran, authorities have blocked WhatsApp and Instagram amid these protests. These were two of the remaining foreign social media platforms available to Iranian users. And then I mentioned legislation. So we've also seen several countries in the region pass legislation that places really onerous restrictions on tech companies seeking to limit the kind of speech permitted on these platforms. So one of these laws is Turkey's social media law. So this was passed in October 2020. And The law is really a means to coerce tech companies into compliance with government censorship and surveillance. So we've seen a couple similar laws passed around the world and in the region, but I'll just kind of go into Turkey's law real quickly because I think it's an interesting example. But the law states that platforms must respond to government-ordered content removal requests within 48 hours. And if they don't comply, authorities can issue harsh fines. They can remove advertising or reduce kind of the bandwidth or traffic to these platforms. And it also requires social media companies to designate a representative in country. So they could be held liable for any failure to remove content that the government may deem as undesirable. But despite these challenges, we have seen, not just in Turkey, but elsewhere, civil society and tech companies successfully pushing back against some of these efforts to curb internet freedom. So in Turkey, Twitter challenged the removal content removal by a Turkish court. And this was ultimately successful. So Twitter won the case and the accounts were restored after the court accepted Twitter's objection. So there are avenues for appeal for tech companies, civil society to continue to push back against some of these repressive orders. And then just to kind of wrap it up, I want to spend a couple minutes talking about Iran. This is one of the world's worst abusers of internet freedom, according to our Freedom on the Net findings. And as Allie mentioned, when she was talking about internet fragmentation, there are only a few countries, including Iran, that are fully disconnecting their online space from the global internet, really in an effort to tightly control the online environment. So in Iran, this kind of centralization of the internet infrastructure is happening through their national internet network. And this enables the government to very easily disconnect internet users from the global web. It facilitates things like internet shutdowns, but specifically localized internet shutdowns. So shutdowns that occur just in a particular region or area. These are less costly than a nationwide internet blackout. And the national internet network also enables government servers to remain online during these localized shutdowns so that government agencies can continue to operate and do their work while the internet is largely disabled for the rest of the population in a given area. And then in addition to just restricting the internet or mobile connectivity, as we've seen kind of going on since the protests started last September in Iran, nearly all foreign social media platforms are blocked in Iran. Thousands of websites are also blocked. And this is just one way that I think, Iranian authorities are isolating internet users from the rest of the global web and forcing people to rely either on state-owned media or domestic apps. Allie kind of touched on this. Many of these domestic apps have really concerning, privacy and surveillance implications. And yeah, I guess just to end on a positive note, as we've seen in Turkey, civil society, tech companies, members of the diaspora, internet freedom advocates have taken really important steps to preserve internet freedom in Iran. So we've seen some really tech savvy companies, working with members of the Iranian diaspora to help remove sensitive information or delete account information from social media users after they've been arrested by security forces. We've seen some tech platforms, calling on users to set up proxy servers. Signal did this in the early days of the protest to make sure that Iranians are able to access encrypted communication services and remain safe online. So I think, when it comes to restricting social media, we've seen that non-democratic leaders really understand the power that these platforms hold, whether it be to organize protests or share information, highlight government abuses, whatever it may be. And governments want to take that power and wield it for their own gain. I'll stop there, but happy to answer any questions and looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, great, Cathryn. That's really terrific. So if I can ask you a question, then ask Allie a question as well. I'm going to just follow up on your Iran example and suggest that, since my recollection is that if you look around Iran, there are a fair number of satellite dishes on many of the homes. So it may not be a social media or even an online information ecosystem that they rely upon. But so perhaps there's information coming in either via television or Farsi language radio programming that allows and runs sort of what we expect now to be an important part of our information ecosystem. Are you noticing, or have you looked at the effects of those more traditional media structures and the effect, for example, on the current demonstrations with the hijab?
Yeah, so freedom on the net looks specifically at the internet and online space. So we aren't specifically looking at like more traditional broadcast, radio, TV, media. However, I think, by closing off Iranians from the outside kind of internet ecosystem, it means that those state-owned media platforms, whether they be online or more traditional media, are going to have kind of a bigger, almost like market share, right? These are going to be the information news sources, the government kind of approved narrative that will be able to kind of take place of any global, international, independent news. So we see this, because most social media platforms, foreign social media platforms are blocked. Lots of independent or human rights related websites are blocked, leaving space for kind of more pro-government or media friendly narratives to take their space. So I can't talk specifically about like the traditional media landscape, but I think that there are some relations just in terms of how the overall like diversity of the landscape is severely weakened when, in international news websites are no longer allowed.
Yeah. Do you also do any sort of research into how credible they find those government-oriented, those government-run institutional structures versus these other non-governmental structures that perhaps are not online and unable to and are able to penetrate?
Yeah, so we have a couple kind of indicators within our Freedom on the Net methodology. One that looks really more at content manipulation by either government outlets or pro-government commentators. And then we also look just at the kind of overall diversity of the online space. So this is, looking at, is misinformation really rampant? Are there independent outlets where people can get, credible or different news or facts or things like that? So we do look at this in certain ways. In terms of like how credible people find the internet, I think that can be a really hard thing to measure. But when you significantly limit what people have access to, I think it makes it harder for people to make informed choices, just given the fact that they're only receiving information perhaps from government vetted narratives. Okay,
so Allie, you talked very specifically to internet fragmentation, and you said there were three areas that you've sort of broken it down into: disconnecting from the internet, secondly, legislation versus data flows, and then finally, limiting access to foreign information and data. Do you also consider what I think Peter Pomerantsev writes about as one of the other approaches to internet, to the fragmentation of information flow, which is flooding the zone, basically making so much alternative information, entertaining information available that in fact it is just as effective as blocking other things out?
Yes, absolutely. So, first I'll say on internet fragmentation, it's a really sort of complex thing to break down. And I think within the internet freedom community too, like defining what counts as internet fragmentation is a little bit contested. So what we tried to do in our understanding of it with last year's Freedom on the Net report is just highlight three ways that, our research found. It's not the only three ways. Because there's a lot of different understandings of like how sort of company actions themselves can help drive fragmentation, and then the sort of the different reasonings based on the regime. Because we actually also found that a lot of democracies are driving internet fragmentation, but for different sort of justifications than some of the more authoritarian countries. So when we're thinking about the spread of false or misleading information, the flooding the zone, I would frame that, the spreading of disinformation in itself is not a form of fragmentation. But what happens is that when you sort of silo your own domestic internet, the impact of disinformation can be more insidious, and, more impactful on users. So if people in the country, because maybe they are, don't have access to more independent news outlets from abroad, they don't have access to, certain international platforms that might label state news media, and they only have access to state-owned media at home or quote unquote quasi-independent that are actually, maybe super cozy to the government. they're going to just have less access to reliable information. So therefore, content that is manipulated or from pro-government sources is going to have an outsized role in that information space. So if we think about, China or Russia or even Iran, because folks don't have access to the BBC, or maybe they don't have access to, in Russia, maybe a local news outlet that was pushed out, like Medusa, that was pushed out of the country or no longer accessible in the country. There's limited sources they can go to. So really thinking about how internet fragmentation can create the preconditions for disinformation to thrive.
So could you, and I'm going to open it up fairly soon and ask for questions as well, but could you also talk about the technological approaches towards undermining this fragmentation and this information sovereignty that's developing? I mean, it seems that that at some point the technology for and running these limits can also exist, whether they be the traditional VPNs or other types of, certainly in the Soviet days when I was there, it was the samizdat and eventually the fax machine, and led to thumb drives being distributed. But where are we today in trying to deal with this rapidly approaching and really spreading information sovereignty reality?
There's a lot of really fantastic donors and work being done to try to give people the tools necessary to push back against some of this fragmentation, push back against disinformation. So there's been a lot of effort to support, virtual private networks, like you mentioned, other circumvention technologies. I mean, VPNs is only one of the tools that people can use when they're in countries that, platforms are blocked, websites are blocked, so they can still access this. So, VPNs is one. There's the Tor project is another sort of censorship circumvention platform people can use. There are broader efforts. I mean, so like VPNs and Tor, what's interesting about those tools is they're really only effective when the internet is still on in a country. So, when Facebook or Twitter or BBC or New York Times or Medusa, when they're blocked, you can use VPNs to sort of access those tools. But in a country where there's a total internet shutdown, those tools don't work anymore. So there's been a lot of really interesting sort of thinking and funding to censorship circumvention groups to really think about what are technical ways to circumvent internet shutdowns completely. So, in Iran a few years ago, there was a nationwide shutdown around protests. What are different ways to build that up? So one is, mesh networks, which try to think about how can we use Bluetooth signals on people's phones to try to build some sort of internet connectivity. So there's some really creative thinking being done around those questions. It's really sort of hard to answer those. And I think there's been also, in Ukraine and Iran too, thinking about how satellites can play a role here when, I think another component of it is in a lot of countries, the governments are increasingly controlling or buying shares in the internet service providers themselves. So they're not privately owned. And when internet service providers traditionally are more beholden to the state, they're less likely to push back against orders to block websites or shut down the internet. So how do we get other sort of technical approaches like satellites to try to circumvent some of that? And I know Google's been doing some thinking. So there's a real interest in this, I would say, and a lot of money is being put out, including by the U.S. State Department, by USAID, by, funding mechanisms in other democracies to really think about how do we support activists or users on the ground to circumvent some of these fragmentation efforts.
Okay, so let me see if there's anyone who has, there's one in the back there. And just state your name and your affiliation.
Hi, good morning. Thank you both so much for being here. My name is Kate, and I'm a first-year graduate student at the LBJ School. And I've been thinking a lot about this internet fragmentation, and thank you so much for finally giving me a term to work with, because I'm just like, what is going on here? So whenever I think historically of populations being cut off from the rest of the world, I think of Berlin during the Cold War and obviously other populations during the Cold War. And I know you mentioned that donors are putting a lot of money towards getting people in these countries access to VPNs, but is there a way that, or if you know, are there any conversations going on in the federal government or in civil society or between these two entities, including social media companies as well, to almost do like a digital Berlin airlift of getting people access to VPNs? I know it's kind of a funky way of thinking about it, but maybe there could be something in the infrastructure of these social media companies that comes with a VPN option that users can buy or sign up for. Again, I don't really know how VPNs work on the ground. I know they're not as simple as a thumb drive, but that's, one thing I've been kind of wrestling with lately. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to hear that term's helpful. So, there's a lot of different research on internet fragmentation, and you can go to our website, freedomonthenet.org, and we sort of outline some of that in one of our main essays. And one of the things I really love about the internet freedom space is, the internet was created through the multi-stakeholder model, right? Like it's governed by not governments, but it's governed by these multi-stakeholder bodies that include private sector, academia, civil society, which means then a lot of the solutions to some of these problems is inherently multi-stakeholder. So when we're when Freedom House or other civil society groups are talking on these issues, we are often talking with experts in industry, not just the big platforms, but some of those smaller, like Cloudflare is a really important one. That is it controls more of some of the technical underpinnings of the internet. It's a content host. So it actually is hosting different websites, or Amazon Web Services. So those are very different how those companies might approach these issues compared to a Facebook, who is sort of at the top of the internet stack and is hosting content. So in conversations, you have people who are industry experts, you have the programmers, you have the people at ICANN who are actually like running the internet. And then you also have the government. So what that means in practice is it's really important to have those different perspectives, because what a civil society solution might be to internet fragmentation might differ from somebody who really understands like the technical deep underpinnings of how the internet functions, or might understand the geopolitics from the government. So when we're thinking about there's a lot of different efforts to build these anonymizing tools within the platforms themselves. So, for example, Jigsaw, which is a subsidiary of Google, and they specialize on censorship circumvention, have rolled out a bunch of different VPN products, and they've worked really closely in the Ukraine context to get people these tools. Twitter as well, I don't know what the current approaches on this, but since the sort of when Russia invaded Ukraine, Twitter incorporated Tor, which is Tor's a nonprofit group that I mentioned earlier. They incorporated the Tor browser within Twitter, which allows certain users to anonymously use Twitter. So you can't trace back where their location is or any sort of real name registration. So that conversation's ongoing. There's a lot of different efforts to build that in so that, the goal is that when we're coming up with censorship circumvention tools, we are making them very easy to use, very easily accessible, and honestly hard to trace. Because what happens is you have a lot of authoritarian governments will say, oh, well, that one VPN, such as TunnelBear, for example, is being used. Let's just block that. So you need to think about diversifying the sort of available tools and then making sure they're really easy to access and really easy to use. So your general person doesn't need some big technical sort of experience to use them. Cathryn, I don't know if there's any other interesting examples that maybe you're aware of too.
I think you covered them. I'll just say on the VPN issue, I think they can be so helpful, especially like in the context that I look at where so many, websites are blocked. VPNs allow people to access this, but you need to have internet service to be able to use VPNs. And this was one of the big challenges we saw in Iran, that, a lot of companies were providing free VPNs to Iranians, but without internet, if there's an internet shutdown, people aren't even able, one, to either download those tools or to use them. So I think this goes back to what Allie was talking about previously about some of these other kind of emerging, thinking on how to circumvent or bypass these internet shutdowns. These VPNs really are more so for accessing censored or blocked content. They're not going to be as helpful if there is an internet shutdown. And, I think another kind of upsetting trend we're seeing is the passing of legislation either banning VPNs or encryption tools, or making it illegal to use encryption tools or like post anonymously or react anonymously online. So there certainly are barriers that are cropping up to people using either VPNs or certain tools that help people say, or the communication say anonymous or encrypted online.
Okay, shall we go to another question? There's one over there.
Hello, my name is Liz Wong, and I'm a second year Master of Global Policy student here at the University of Texas. I will try to only ask one question because this is really interesting. But when we talk about these private companies spending all this money to develop tools to help people circumvent or find digital freedom and go around the digital firewalls, they are private companies acting, but they're acting on what many would assume are democratic or U.S. values. Do these authoritarian countries, do they see this as a threat against their rule, or do they see it as maybe the U.S. is losing soft power with them as these private companies are attempting to make these tools? I would love to hear input. And if I can ask a second question, I know it might not be allowed, but we talked about earlier how internet fragmentation can lead to spaces that are really delicious for disinformation campaigns. All these tools take a lot of money. They have to be made probably by bigger companies, but yet we're against monopolies here, usually in the United States. But these larger companies that are making these information spheres are safer for people in areas that are contested or might be behind bars or information bars. They might need the larger companies. So I was wondering if in a perfect digital sphere, do you look for these smaller companies that perhaps can't develop these tools or don't have as much content moderation, or the larger companies that might threaten them to monopolize that can do all these larger tools and can do content moderation? Thank y'all.
Happy to take the first stab. Is that all right, Cathryn, with you? Thank you for asking. I think we can squeeze both answers. And so on the question of sort of companies and threat, I mean, there's been a lot of work done in the past 5 to 10 years by civil society to push a lot of it, some of these major players, international platforms, to align their company policies and practices and the products they develop with international human rights law. So I'd actually push back in thinking about it as US values, because actually, a lot of the content moderation that these companies are doing go a lot further than sort of First Amendment, what would be only allowed to be taken down on First Amendment. And it's actually really important they do, because, really strong First Amendment protections are really important in the US. But if they only adhere to that, you would have a lot of really tough and dangerous speech on the platform. So that is, I frame it like that because I actually think it's really important. And thinking through how the First Amendment actually allows companies themselves to moderate content in a way that matches their policies. So civil society has worked really hard to better these companies' content moderation so they align with international human rights standards. There's still a very long way to go in making sure that companies actually do that consistently, that they are working with local civil society groups around the world. We have a long way to go on that. So I don't want to praise them too much, but acknowledge that there's been progress. And I think as you've seen some of that progress, and as companies have tried to be more consistent in those rules, try to push back against government demands that would, violate free expression standards under human rights law, such as in India or Russia or Turkey, those governments then are getting mad and saying, well, if you're going to operate in our countries, you're going to adhere to our local law, and our local law allows us to ban the speech we want to ban. So in response to companies at times, I'm trying to simplify this, it's a little bit more complicated, but in response to that, they're increasing demands for blocks on these platforms to just limit them altogether, or increasing regulatory oversight of them to try to force them into behaving the way the government wants. So an interesting example of that is actually in Nigeria. The Twitter, I think it was 2021. Yes, 2021. Twitter actually restricted a post by the country's president that threatened secessionist violence. And in response, Nigeria's government got really mad and was like, how are you censoring a problematic post by our president? They blocked Twitter because Twitter refused to uncensor it. And then Twitter said, well, we definitely want access to this market, and then agreed to a host of demands to get unblocked. So that is sort of this battle that you're seeing between international platforms that are, trying to improve content moderation, getting it wrong still a lot of times, and governments that want to increase their control over it. On the second question, it's an interesting sort of approach to think about, in order to do content moderation well, it's extremely, extremely hard because there's billions of posts a day and it's really expensive. And a lot of times the companies that can afford that are ones that are bigger. I would, the way we think about it is competition is really, really important for the diversity of the online space and for human rights. And we don't have enough competition right now in the market. We have too few platforms and we want more platforms. How that could look could be really different. If you're interested to read more about like the different options for social media, I would really recommend Ethan Zuckerman. He has done a lot of thinking. He's a sort of scholar in this area, has done a lot of thinking about, what would it look like to have a lot of small platforms that are really attuned to particular community needs. One example is called Arwa. It's a sort of platform that is focused on the LGBTQ community and MENA. Another one is Twitter. It's a Twitter platform for sex workers that so he's done some really interesting thinking. I would really urge you to go read him. But I want to think about it as a dichotomy. We have to choose one or the other, but think about it as, an ecosystem where you want a bunch of different players that serve different roles. So one of those could be a Meta. One of those could be one of these smaller platforms. And how do we create conditions and incentives through regulation or through legal frameworks that create strong protections for free expression and privacy and access to information? And how do we do that in a way that can both hold bigger companies accountable while also creating the space for smaller companies to come about?
So we've only got a couple of minutes. So if you want to, Cathryn, if you want to say something, but also maybe wrap it up for us.
I think Allie did a comprehensive job. If we want to do one more question, we can. Up to you.
Okay. Do we have another question? Okay, not from the audience. So what happens in these circumstances that you've described, these trends that you've outlined for us, as we move more towards a wartime footing? This is something that's not just something we're seeing in Ukraine, but it is potentially in this more fragmenting world and one where we're finding a bifurcation. How are you looking at this as Freedom House in preparation for what may potentially be a much more harsh environment for information, one that even the United States recognizes as one that's allowed to be controlled?
I can just quickly start and say, I think some kind of trends that maybe we're keeping an eye on that relate to, some of these themes around internet fragmentation. And one is, seeing governments kind of learn from each other. So around whether that's centralizing the internet infrastructure, as we see mostly in, the Russia, Iran, China's, but we're also seeing kind of similar initiatives of this centralized, internet being rolled, I think, in Cambodia and in Iraq. So keeping an eye on those kind of initiatives to further centralize and control the online space within a country's given borders. And then another, I think, is legislation. Specifically, we've seen, not just in the Middle East, but around the world, a lot of legislation passed around, disinformation and kind of curtailing free speech online under the guise of combating disinformation. And disinformation, as we know, is a huge problem in the online sphere. It does require a lot of work, not just, government regulation, but on the level of tech platforms and digital literacy and civil society initiatives. And some of these are underway. But yeah, I'll give it to Allie if you want to add anything else, but I'd say those are kind of two things that I think we're keeping an eye on.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I really worry about democracies not living up to their own values at home and actually using the same tactics as the ones they're criticizing. Specifically, there's a lot. I know there was a TikTok panel earlier. I'm sure it was super interesting. We also are very concerned about the impact of companies that are owned by Chinese companies, but also really don't think bans and blocks are the way to go. And we really worry about the normalization of censorship there. And if the US government or other democracies were to ban a platform that millions of Americans use, not to mention the sort of First Amendment implications of that would be very serious and arguably raises questions of constitutionality, but it would just fuel the arguments by more authoritarian regimes of saying, hey, you blocked a platform, we're going to do it too during an election. So really pushing democracies, how do we deal with the real harms of the digital age, such as disinformation, such as harassment, but how do we do it in a way that aligns with our values and isn't actually making the problem worse?
Thank you both, Allie and Cathryn. It's been an informative session, and we'll move on to the next one. Thanks again. Thanks for being with us.